Welcome back everyone, I got another Elden Ring build video for you today. We're going to go over the Black Knife Assassin build. This build is going to include a lot of the things that you'd expect out of an assassin gameplay type, plus one weapon that I haven't seen anyone really talking about, but as far as I can tell, it's actually the best dagger in the game, so we'll cover that here as well. I wanted to create a build that focused on stealth gameplay and really relied on critical hits because daggers have a much higher critical damage multiplier than any other weapon. This is especially true for the Misericord, which is the main weapon we're going to be used for backstabbing. This is where you're going to get the highest amount of damage, except if you parry. This is why we also carry the buckler around. You can either use the default parry skill, or later when you pick up the golden parry Ash of War, you can use that one as well. I actually prefer that one a little bit more because it gives you a little bit more range, so it's a little more forgiving, but either will work. For enemies that you can't really backstab or sneak up on, generally like the mini bosses, also any enemies that are really easy to parry, that buckler is going to come in handy, and it's really going to let that Misericord do a lot of damage. In cases where you're not able to parry, like large bosses, because they swing so fast, it helps you stay really agile, so you can get an attack off real quick, dodge roll, and then get a few more attacks off, and the damage adds up extremely quickly. The other main way you're going to be dealing damage is with the Black Blade skill. Blade of Death decreases the enemy's max health by 10% and also applies a damage over time effect. This skill does a lot of damage, and so when you need to deal with enemies at a distance, you can kill most of the weaker enemies with just one shot of this. It's also extremely effective against bosses because it deals that 10% damage to their maximum HP. So I'll use the Blade of Death and the Misericord in my main hand, switching between the two depending on what situation I'm in. If I'm running around backstabbing a bunch of enemies, I'll keep the Misericord on because that deals the most critical strike damage. And I like to keep Royal Knight's Resolve on it, which increases the damage we deal by 50%. With this dagger fully upgraded and Royal Knight's Resolved, you should be able to one-shot just about any enemy in the game. There are a couple of exceptions, but they're not in the game until much, much later. And even then, we have other tools available to us that make them easy to deal with as well. Depending on how you play this build, it can be fairly easy to fairly difficult. If you're relying on the buckler to parry a lot, it's a more difficult play style because you have to time your parries well. If you don't opt for the parry gameplay style, it's actually pretty easy. You'll sneak around undetected most of the time, and you'll pick off enemies one by one. If you are detected, we have a couple of spells that we can use to deal with groups of enemies so that we can go run, hide, and reset the fight if we need to. Alright, I promised you I'd talk about what I believe is the best dagger in the game that no one's really talking about, and it's actually the Erdsteel dagger. This is one that you get from Kevin Haight right away at the start of the game, and then there's also one available much later in the game, so you could dual wield these if you wanted to, but I just like to have it in my offhand so that I can use it when I'm dual wielding and getting my attacks off really quick. The reason the Erdsteel dagger is so strong is because both the physical and holy damage are going to scale with your faith. And if you read the description of the weapon, it actually tells you that. But so far as I can tell, no one's really been using this to its full potential. Because we're pumping both dexterity and faith for this build, it makes the Erdsteel dagger the best performing dagger at a really high level of play. It's also nice having this in the offhand because you can add a separate Ash of War besides Royal Knight's Resolve, which we're using on the Misericord. I like to use Bloodhound Step, so if I ever need it, I can just two-hand my offhand dagger and use it to get around the battlefield. I don't use it too often because I find that for slow-moving enemies that I'm trying to run around, it's better to just sprint around them or dodge around them rather than Bloodhound Step, because Bloodhound Step often goes a little bit too far, and I find the animation a little bit too slow to get reliable backstabs. But there are some fights where you're going to want to use it to either gain some distance or close that distance really quickly. As I already mentioned, we're using a buckler here. I have the golden parry, but you can use the regular parry skill just as well. And then for our finger seal, I'm using the Erd Tree seal, but earlier in the game you can use the finger seal. And really you can use just about any finger seal you want, because almost all of the incantations that we're casting aren't dealing damage. They're just support incantations and they don't really scale with our seal. So it actually doesn't matter until you get late in the game which seal you're using. For your armor, the only important piece is the black knife armor, because this is going to muffle your footsteps. This makes it so that you can sprint around as though you were crouched, so you don't make any noise when you're sprinting or jumping or falling or rolling, and you can get around really quickly without anyone hearing you. For all the other pieces, it's totally optional. I just use the rest of the black knife set except for the helm. I use the skeletal mask for my helmet just because I think it looks pretty cool. But you can sub those out for anything that you'd like. There's actually a lot of different talismans that work well for this build. The main ones that I would say are really required is the dagger talisman, because we're trying to boost our critical strikes as much as we possibly can. And then also the sacred scorpion charm, because we're dealing a lot of holy damage, and so it's really important that we raise that holy attack as much as we can. My other favorites are the Ritual Sword Talisman, because you're going to be at max health most of the time when you're playing this build correctly. You shouldn't really be engaging enemies unless you're doing a parry, because you'll sneak around, you'll get your backstab off, and 98 or 99% of the time you'll kill them in one shot. And if you do aggro other enemies, usually there's a way to reset them so that we can start our backstab spree again. And then, of course, the Crimson and Cerulean daggers are useful. Each time you deal a critical strike, it'll either heal you or restore some FP. So I use those situationally depending on which area I'm in and which one's more useful to me. But then also the Shard of Alexander is a good talisman to sub out here if you're going to be using that Black Blade skill a lot. It is worth noting that the Black Knife Tiche Ash is able to cast the same skill that's on the black knife, and it doesn't stack. So if either your Ash casts it or if you cast it, it only applies that debuff one time, but the damage will stack. For our skills, the main and most important one is going to be Darkness. So this skill is really useful because you can cast it and it sort of casts this AoE in front of you, and any enemies that get close to it, their eyes fill up with this black smoke, and they become unaware that you're even there, and so it sort of resets them. So you can use this time to either just run away, or you can just sneak up behind them and backstab them. And you can usually backstab like up to 3 enemies like this really quickly before the effect wears off. The other skill that's going to be useful is Shadow Bait. I'd say Shadow Bait isn't quite as useful as Darkness, but it does use a lot less FP, so it makes it more mana efficient. It doesn't work on all enemy types, and neither does Darkness, but it seems like Darkness works on more enemies than Shadow Bait does. But Shadow Bait puts this little piece of smoke on the ground that makes enemies focus it. Usually it's foes of human or similar build. And so they'll just kind of swing at that smoke spot on the ground, which is good if there's a lot of enemies that you want to focus on something so you can evade them, or while they're swinging at it, you can sneak up behind them and backstab them. And then, of course, Golden Vow. Golden Vow is going to improve our damage and our defenses, so that one's, of course, really important. I usually only use it for boss fights. It's not generally required for running around the landscape. And very late in the game, you're able to pick up the Black Blade incantation. This deals damage very similarly to how the Black Knife does. However, it doesn't deal as much damage. It costs a lot more FP, and it can be cast twice. So usually if you cast it twice, it deals similar damage to the weapon skill of the Black Knife, but it uses way more FP, so it's not as efficient. The upside to it is it deals damage in a line, so it will penetrate enemies. So if you have a big group of enemies all in a line, it'll damage all of them, whereas the Black Knife weapon skill will only damage the first one it hits. And then the other upside to it is it has a longer range. So if you need to snipe someone and the Black Knife won't reach it for whatever reason, you just need that extra range, the Black Blade has a much longer range, and so you can use it in those situations. For our Wondrous Physic, we want to boost our holy attacks again because that's going to help improve our damage output during boss fights. And then also the Green Burst tier because we're going to need the stamina regen as we're attacking bosses. For both our Misericord and Earthsteel daggers, we want to choose the Sacred Affinity because this is going to help our damage scale with faith. And it's going to make us deal holy damage, which is the main damage type that we're boosting with our Scorpion Charm and our Wondrous Physic. All right, let's talk about stats. For your Vigor, you're going to want to get it up to around 30 or 40, and it really depends on your skill level. So if you're really good at parrying and sneaking around and getting backstabs, you don't really need a whole lot of Vigor because you probably won't get hit very much. But if you're like me and you kind of stink at it, then you're going to want a little bit more Vigor. I think I settled around 40, and then as I kept playing, I went up a little bit higher to like 40, 45. For Mind, I went up to 26 Mind because this is the minimum that you need to summon the Black Knife TJ Ash. But earlier in the game, you don't really need a lot of Mind. We're not casting spells too often. The spells that we use don't use a lot of FP. Your main cast is going to be from your Black Knife, which actually doesn't use too much FP. So I'd say early in the game, anywhere from like 15 to 20 should get you through like the mid game. And then for late game, you'll want to go up to, 25, maybe up to 30 for late game. Endurance, we don't really need any at all. Swinging daggers doesn't require very much stamina, so it doesn't drain us too much. We can get off a lot of attacks, and so we can get away with really low endurance. Also, we're not wearing super heavy armor for this build, so we don't really need those points, and they're better allocated elsewhere. If you want to wear heavier armor, you could throw a few points in here, but I don't think it's really necessary. Strength, we don't need any at all because our weapons don't require it. Intelligence and Arcane, we don't need to add any points there either. And so that leaves just Dexterity and Faith, which is going to impact all of our damage. Early in the game, when you don't have a lot of attributes, you're probably going to be better off focusing on Dexterity and using the Keen Affinity for your Misericord. Once you reach a point in the game when you can apply the Holy Affinity, you'll want to focus on getting your Faith up to around 50 to 60, and then after that start bringing Dexterity up until it's about in line with your Faith. And then leveling from there, you can kind of keep them at about the same level. This build excels at taking out single enemies, and it only struggles with more enemies if they're immune to both Darkness and Shadow Bait. But if they're not immune to those skills, you should be able to take them out one by one very easily. You should be using Royal Knight's Resolve before backstabbing if you know you're not going to deal enough damage to one-shot them. For enemies that attack slow and are relatively easy to parry, that's when I'll use parry. Even the really tough enemies like those Crucible Knights are pretty easy if you're even decent with parrying. The Buckler parry is the most forgiving one, and there's a lot of resources online explaining why. But I tried parrying with various weapons, and I couldn't do it with a lot of them, but even with the Buckler parry, I was able to do it pretty consistently. And then for large bosses that you can't parry and you can't backstab, your main go-to is going to be the weapon skill on your Black Knife. You'll just queue up Blade of Death and you'll cast that repeatedly to bring him down. All right, that about wraps it up for this build. This has been one of my favorite builds to put together and play. It's extremely fun to do. I got a few more builds in mind that I'm going to be working on, so stay tuned for those, and we'll see you next time.